welcome everyone to another Swedenborgiancommunity.org broadcast. As you may be able to hear, but possibly see if you're joining us on YouTube, I am under a tarp tonight because the sky clouded over and started drizzling on me right before the service. So actually, I have a good setup. I think we'll survive, hopefully. And not only that, we are joined by the marvelous Colin Amato. Hi, Colin.
Hey, Corey. How's it going?
It's going really well. How are you?
I'm doing good, thank you. I'm sitting in the middle of my apartment, hopefully having enough, at least decent cell service for you to hear me and for me to hear you throughout this time together.
Oh, I hear you just fine. I hope the people listening can hear you as well. We're very honored to have you on this evening. Let me just spell out some of your credentials and cover anything I'm missing, but you are an associate marriage and family therapist and also a Swedenborgian Seminarian. Am I correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Well, wonderful. How are those things striking you these days? Are you involved with both seminary and your therapist work right now?
Yes. And before I answer that question, I just want to thank you for having me on as well. It's an honor. It's an honor for me to be speaking with you. Both things are happening simultaneously because I'm a Gemini, and for what that's worth, I have a habit of doing way too much at the same time. So yes, I see clients, every week, and on top of that, also attending classes for seminary, and then starting. Actually, this coming Monday, I'll be starting my clinical pastoral education experience at a hospital here in the Bay Area. So yeah, things are going to get really interesting in a couple days here.
That's quite a bit of work to put on. It sounds like that's pretty heavy stuff too. It's not easy.
Yeah, no, I would say it's definitely not easy, but I enjoy everything. I mean, I'm still when people ask me, you ask me how are things going, and I would say that things are going well. It's nice to be at a place where I enjoy getting up and going to work. I enjoy working with my clients, and being in seminary has definitely changed me since the time I started to up to this point. So, it's all great.
Well, that's wonderful. So seminary has been somewhat of a transformative experience for you.
It has. Definitely. I mean, just a lot of personal spiritual experiences, a lot of great moments, special moments, traveling to Sweden with you and the rest of our crew. That was, it's just been overall, it's just been a very transformative experience, both, emotionally, spiritually. I definitely am not the same person I was when I started seminary, that's for sure.
Yeah, I had a similar feeling, still do, about the transformation within seminary, and I'm sure, even, any grad program is quite a transformative one, let alone one that asks you to reflect on yourself constantly and express, the mysteries of the world, if you can. Absolutely.
It's very true.
Well, yeah, I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and it's nice to connect. We don't always, get a chance or take the moments to connect when we're not around each other. So it's really, really cool to have you on.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's very. I think there's a part of me that's still sort of in denial that you're not in the Bay Area anymore. Like, there's a part of me that's like, I walk across campus and I expect to see you, but I'm very happy for you, the way things have turned out, for you since graduating and getting ordained. So I'm very happy for you.
Oh, thanks, Colin. And my heart's with you in that journey. And I only had seminary and like the chaplaincy at a hospital and my internship at a church. You have those things and your therapist practice. I mean, how? Yeah. Do you have spiritual practice that upholds you, that fortifies your spirit and your work?
Yeah, I would say that probably more of like a contemplative prayer or specifically meditation, but that's really helpful. But honestly, taking walks out in nature or walking around outside, especially at night, here in Berkeley, and having a chance to just kind of look up and sort of see the stars, even though we're in a city, but there's something about just kind of getting out of the inside of a dwelling and being out in nature. And if I can, I like to try and walk, in parks or places where I'm more likely to see, animals. But to be honest, there's a family of deer. I don't know if you knew this. Maybe you did know this when you were still here, Corey. But there's actually a family of deer that hang out at PSR's campus, and so that's pretty exciting to walk across the quad and see some deer just sort of hanging out. So it's amazing. It's moments like it's moments like that, and also I would say music and singing to music has always been, I guess for me, a very spiritual practice or psychological practice, and that's also something that I try and do like every day. So those are the things that keep me going.
Really?
Yeah. Do you sing every day? I know you're quite a singer.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, during the commute, I just roll. My car doesn't have air conditioning, so I have to roll all the windows down, and then I'm blasting my Black Sabbath and and I'm singing along to Black Sabbath. And at first I was a little self-conscious because I thought, well, I'm not really sure how, because I also have hearing loss in both ears. So sometimes I actually don't know, like, one, how loud am I actually singing? And then two, I actually don't know how loud the music is. And driving through Berkeley, I thought, at first I thought, oh, I'm a little self-conscious because I could be pulling up to a red light and people are going to be hearing me sing like Iron Man or something. And then I just kind of got over that and thought, well, this is a little, fun thing for them to hear for about 5 seconds of their life, and then I'll drive on, so.
Yeah, it's always fun to come across someone belting it out, and especially the Iron Man or the type of songs that it sounds like you're singing.
That's right. Yeah. Yep.
Well, wonderful. It's inspiring to hear about your practice. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that is, your therapist practice?
Oh, my therapist practice. Yeah, I would say, well, right. So I had spread myself kind of thin. I was actually working at a couple different locations, and I've actually consolidated my practice to just being at the Rainbow Community Center, which serves Contra Costa County in California. And so I primarily, although not all, but I primarily work with clients who are members of the LGBTQ plus community. And my role there is to provide psychotherapy or mental health counseling, but I also do pastoral or spiritual counseling as well. And a lot of the time, I'm doing both. So I sort of practice a lot of the time a modality which is called spiritually integrated psychotherapy, which is something that I've had a little bit of training around. And it's a style of psychotherapy that doesn't ignore the evidence-based or traditional psychotherapeutic approaches, but what it does is it recognizes that people have existential questions that they are trying to figure out, and that those existential questions affect their lives. And so there's this openness to exploring topics about spirituality or the meaning of life or death or life after death or whatever it might be. So I find that a lot of the time I have clients in the LGBTQ community that are definitely concerned about their mental health, their physical health, but they also are concerned about their spiritual lives as well, and whether it's them believing in God or not, or whatever that might mean to them. There definitely seems to be a growing emphasis on individuals seeking counseling with the purpose of trying to figure out how to use some sort of spiritual practice, usually to help them with their self-care. So a lot of the time I am just on the quest with them. I'm going through this journey of life with my clients, and it really is it's been an amazing experience to be working with this population and to see all the different presenting reasons why people need counseling right now.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like quite the impactful and needed work. And you can speak to people in the LGBTQ setting maybe more than some of us, and because you identify as gay, I believe. You're quite open, so I feel like I can say that.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. So how does that impact your ministry and all of this? I'm curious. I mean, in the high level version.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does. It depends on who I'm talking to. I mean, I think some people in the LGBTQ community are kind of surprised when I say that I'm a minister in training and also identify as gay. Because there's been a lot of trauma as a result of organized religion to the LGBTQ community or the queer community, and so when they're actually talking with someone who isn't trying to convert them or convince them that their sexual or gender identity is at odds with wanting to be religious spiritual, but in fact encouraging them and supporting them in a reconciling, balancing, if you will, or I guess, balance isn't even the right word. I would say it's more of just accepting the fact that you could be a spiritual or religious being and also be a sexual being simultaneously, that one is not exclusive and one doesn't shove out the other. I think that there's, I guess they feel more comfortable talking with me because they know that I identify as gay and have consistently been a spiritual person. I mean, my religious and philosophical and metaphysical views have definitely changed and warped over the years, but I would say that I've been consistently spiritual from as far back as I can remember, and I've had some personal experience really struggling with organized religion and being gay. And so I think that combination of a personal experience and also making sure that I'm applying or able to apply the tools that I'm learning to this community, to my community, I think that's all the things that are really helpful for me to do the work that I do.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like quite the calling you have, and yeah, I can see how that would be helpful. Wow. And yeah, it's not every day we come across a spirituality, a religion that is open and affirming to the queer community, and it's unfortunate. Of course, it's been a tragedy for quite a long time that religious folks, we've behaved that way, and so it's I can only commend you highly, knowing you and just hearing what you just said for that call and that ministry. That's really beautiful, Colin.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's definitely a struggle, and I think that just the more ministers who are preaching sermons that are inclusive, the more theologians who are approaching texts and theological or metaphysical ideas that are inclusive, of all gender and sexual expressions, I think, and identities. I think that's the way forward, and just kind of being willing to just be honest about any tradition and its baggage in this regard, because people I think do need to hear that a congregation or a denomination or even a whole religion is open and accepting. But I know for me, what strikes me as equally important is being able to be upfront and critical about the history of one's tradition, especially given the historical and cultural baggage that Christianity and especially, I would say, a lot of, most of the Abrahamic faith certainly have a history of oppressing the queer community. And I think that LGBTQ folks really appreciate knowing that the ministers or imams or rabbis that are open and affirming are also doing research or are writing or are speaking to that history and are basically saying, okay, so these are all of the really nasty things that happened in the past. So how can we learn from this and move forward into the future in a progressive way? Because, of course it's important to have a rainbow flag outside of a congregation, or to know that someone who identifies as queer is welcome in the church. But there's going to be a lot of questions, and I think that those questions and that dialogue is also very important, in my opinion.
Yeah, questions from the queer community, from the individual to the church or to the organization. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to reconnect and open, somewhat safe and trusting lines of dialogue with, various demographics that have been abused by, some of our religious institutions and even our societal structures. We have to go through a process of healing, hopefully. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that seems to be your calling. I mean, the similar thread in your in the things that you're working on now with seminary and chaplaincy and your therapy work is healing in my mind. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say it feels kind of funny calling myself a healer, because it feels like that's just sort of but I guess that's true. But I think the reason why I say it's weird is because, I really do identify with what Carl Jung calls the wounded healer archetype, which is a particular archetype that is activated in folks who, identify with wanting to help people, but they have their own problems, because let's face it, we all have problems. But what makes the wounded archetype activate in the behavior of a particular person is when they are actively trying to heal others, but they're actively engaging in their own healing process. So you have two psyches that are simultaneously being healed, both because of the therapeutic relationship, but also because the therapist or the minister or the chaplain has their own therapist or their own spiritual director, or they're getting their own pastoral counseling while giving counseling to their own patients or clients. So there's a lot of insight that happens when you can, if you deal with, let's say, depression or an anxiety, or what a panic attack feels like, and then when you're in the room with somebody who tells you that they've experienced panic attacks, I mean, it's a subjective experience, but because you've both had those experiences, the therapist is able to really have a much better idea of what the client's going through, as opposed to saying, oh, well, I kind of know what panic attacks are because, I can read it in the DSM, or I can hear what my client's saying, but there is, and that's all really important to know in terms of a knowledge base and clinical knowledge. But I would say, really, for me, being a healer is somebody who who is still actively dealing with their own healing while trying to help other people. So
Wow.
that's how I would view myself, definitely.
Well, often a healer or a minister or even therapist, they don't acknowledge that aspect of themselves often, especially not directly to the person that they're ministering with. I mean, often it can be like a story of testimony for ministers, but we tend to shy away from revealing our vulnerability and the illnesses that we're working through spiritually and otherwise.
Sure, yeah, and there are some ethical guidelines around like self-disclosure. Like I certainly don't sit down and my clients start telling me stuff, and I don't sit there and go, "Oh, you think you have it bad? Well,
Yeah.
like let me tell you all about me," right? Like that's totally inappropriate. But what I mean by the healing that happens in the therapeutic context is that sometimes your client will remind you of someone that you know. And so this is, not to get too heady here, but in a nutshell, this is usually called transference and countertransference. And so, you might remind your client of somebody that they know, like a father figure or a mother figure, and just through the relationship of being able to recognize that they're projecting that onto the clinician, they're able to work through whatever relational trauma has occurred, even if it's largely unconscious. And again, Carl Jung was famous for saying that the countertransference, or what happens with the therapist towards the client, it can be very similar. So if I have a client that's like an elder who might remind me of like a grandparent or a parent figure, if I'm hearing what their struggles are and I experience their healing process, even unconsciously, there might be a part of me that is being transformed in some way as a result of knowing or having the honor of hearing these stories from these people that I'm working with week and week, every week, and so it definitely is a transformative experience, I would say.
Well, that's quite inspiring, and I think something we can all apply to our living and our ministering, because even if we're not in a role like the one you're in or the one I'm in, I think we're all in a ministry. We're ministering kind of our deepest motivations as we move through the world and try to fulfill them, try to impact other people with them, or get our way, or whatever it is. It's a type of ministry, and reflecting on what that ministry is and how we can heal to better uplift other people and also to uplift health in ourselves is really the name of the game, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, when I first started my field ed, which is how during my second year of seminary, which is how I got involved with the Rainbow Community Center, it was interesting because when I first started, I really had pastoral care and psychotherapy sort of in two separate parts of my brain. And I think that there was a natural reason for that at the very beginning. But as I kept working with clients that were presenting with genuine mental health concerns, but also wanting to talk about some of the big life questions and entering into the realm of existentialism or spirituality, I found that there were times where both things were happening at the same time. And then I realized that the logical conclusion of that was my work was not just clinical work, but as you just said, Corey, the work was also taking on sort of a ministerial role as well. And there were times where both things were happening at the same time. So, it's I think certainly these experiences are not owned by one profession. I think because they're all healing professions or professions that are trying to help people change and experience self-improvement and growth, that all of these experiences can be shared by people regardless if they're pastors or psychologists or what have you.
Yeah. And thank you, Colin, for those insightful thoughts. I want to take a moment just to say hi to all the people in our Chatsy at chatsy.com/Swedenborg. The few of you who want to chat with us live, it's always nice to be able to communicate with you. But also hi to all those on Blog Talk Radio and in our podcasts, and also on YouTube nowadays. If you want to find these services there, we as you know, watching, we appear there a couple days later. And I want to uplift something that Albert shared. He says, it's interesting how often Spirit raises up ministers from identified communities, and hence purely appropriate ministry ensues. Yeah, and that's kind of a beautiful idea, and I love even like making it a metaphor of uplifting the minister and each other. Let me share something I ran across recently at camp. They were uplifting the idea of the good, the Good Samaritan. Who is the neighbor? And often we listen to that story and then we preach later that the neighbor is everybody, or we should uplift everyone. And in a way, that's true. But in that story, Jesus uplifts the idea that who is the neighbor? It's the Good Samaritan. It's the person who may outwardly be someone very different than you, but is willing to offer help. And that neighbor lives in all of us. It's that good motivation and that good action. And uplifting that in everyone we meet is kind of like uplifting the minister or the ministry in everyone, and doing that with ourselves, that's true as well, right?
Yeah, I would agree with my takeaway from Albert's thoughts, is sort of a weird, kind of an uncanny experience that I've had since working at the Rainbow Center, because at first when I got there, because identifying as a gay man, I actually was kind of skeptical that I was going to get any clients that wanted to talk about religion or spirituality, right? Because I went in there knowing how much harm has been done to the queer community at the hands of organized religion, and yet even if the client didn't put on the intake, I'd like to talk to somebody who's interested in spirituality, I kid you not, the vast majority of my caseload are people who organically end up talking about their spirituality or their philosophical views on life. And so, whether that's coincidence or divine providence or, just some sort of uncanny experience that I've had, I mean, it just feels like I'm definitely in the right place, and that I should be there, and that I'm meant to be working with the people that I'm working with. So, and these are folks who demographically speaking, come from different socioeconomic statuses, different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different ages, and so certainly I have meditated very often on the story of the Good Samaritan in doing this work, because you have no idea who someone's going to be when you first get that intake, because you just have some factual information, and then you meet them and they are a stranger when you first meet them. and then it grows from being strangers to a very unique type of interaction.
Wow. Yeah, and an injured stranger, as we all are, as the wounded healer motif kind of uplifts, right?
Absolutely.
It's a nice thing to remember when we encounter maybe someone at work or out in the world that we have a really hard time with, we don't get along with them, what have you, that in a way that is like the perfect picture of the Good Samaritan story, of running across someone that you, at least from your perspective, is injured. Maybe they're mean towards other people, maybe they lash out, or narcissistic, what have you. And of course we each have some of those aspects in ourselves. And coming across that, especially when it's really brutal, in a way, we often want to turn away and run away, or that's the person I need to create distance with, which often is the case. But that distance and also how we behave towards them could be part of that healing motif of being the Good Samaritan and taking the time to reflect on how can I help this person heal from whatever cause these injuries, whatever these injuries are.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it really is something that Carl Rogers talked about. Carl Rogers, the famous humanistic psychotherapist, who really talked about unconditional positive regard and extreme, basically deep empathy. And he practiced that with every client that he ever had. I mean, he could sit in a room with literally anybody with any issue, and outside of the consultation room, he may not have ever dreamt of spending 50 minutes with some of the clients that he had, but because he was committed to this unconditional positive regard and this deep empathy, he could sit in a room with anybody. And I think that's I definitely think that's really hard to do sometimes. And there are moments where you feel uncomfortable. There are moments where a client might say something that you completely disagree with, but the point of your job is to facilitate a safe space for them to say whatever they want to say, express whatever they want to say, and experience the healing that works for them. And that is what you're meant to do.
Well, yeah, that could be really tough, being in the room with anyone and feeling that calling of not kind of judging or at least expressing those when maybe someone you might encounter could have done some brutal things that they're sharing, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah, and I'm curious how your therapy work kind of informs your call to ministry and your seminary experience. Like, where do you see that going moving forward?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I'm definitely still interested in learning more about spiritual direction, specifically. I'm always interested in knowing what additional tools I can add to my existing toolbox. So for clinical work, and so I think going forward, certainly being able to provide more spiritual counseling to folks who need it. I think I'm definitely interested in pursuing Jungian work as well, or Jungian training. All these things sort of kind of ebb and flow and come together. They complement each other, I should say. So I think I'm going to be one of these folks that just keeps wanting to learn more and more. I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. So.
Sounds about right. And putting it into practice in multiple ways, it sounds like.
Yeah. I think one thing that a huge thing that I think my clinical work has taught me in terms of my training as a minister is, one, to be, to really try to, recognize my own, I guess, to use Jungian speak, like shadow side, the parts of me that have their own dysfunction, my own complexes, and then trying to, process those things in relationship with a bigger community, because clinical work can be kind of isolating. You're by yourself. You're in a room with another person. Maybe it's a couple. Maybe it's a family. Maybe it's a group. But really, ministry, you are exposed to a lot more people on a more frequent basis. So you're dealing with group dynamics way more frequently, I would say, than clinicians sometimes deal with. And so I think my clinical tools have helped me at least try to navigate larger religious group dynamics. I can't say I've always been successful in either navigating those waters as well as I should, or come out of some of those things unscathed. But I will say that it certainly, again, adds to, they complement each other, as I say.
Yeah, I could see that, and Yeah, it's interesting how these not really disparate elements, but how these different experiences and expertises in each of our lives can kind of come together in beautiful ways to make something even more perhaps helpful, or put more tools at our fingertips to work in the world in a way that uplifts health. And of course, in your case, you're quite directly looking to do that as your expertise. Do you ever find it's tough to be in a therapy session? Or I know you work with all kinds of different individuals, and you've mentioned to me like working with kids in like family settings and kind of not experimental, but like ways that I hadn't heard before. So I'm just curious, is it sometimes tough, and are there things that have kind of inspired you, like new ways of approaching therapy?
Yeah, I mean, I think every clinician kind of finds that the population or the style or the particular clinical setting that they really are drawn to. I mean, I certainly enjoy doing more long-term work with individuals. I found working with couples to be quite a challenge. That was some of the most stressful work, and I would say working with whole families can be pretty stressful too, but I've had some pretty rewarding experiences working with whole families. Wow. I think, really there are just certain diagnoses or certain presenting situations that can present challenges. And I think what I've learned is that the best thing I've learned out of all of this work is that you don't have to solve the problem or problems in one therapy session, and I think sometimes when we get flustered, or at least I know when I get flustered or when I start to worry, like, wow, there's a lot going on with this person, I think it's just helpful to know that you don't need to deal with everything in 50 minutes. And also recognizing that just because one person is dealing with maybe a whole host of things, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of those things are going to suddenly appear in the room in the course of a 50-minute session, right? So there are breaks, there are pauses, there are, so you can really kind of strategize in between sessions, and you can get consultation, you can get support, and I think that is something that makes the work manageable. It still can be a huge challenge. I mean, therapists will routinely say that they're happy when they have clients that are just kind of coming in because maybe they're just kind of dealing with like a life transition or something, right? It's nothing really heavy or severe, and definitely engaging in self-care. Self-care is a really important thing. Knowing when to say no to a referral. If you know that your caseload already has a pretty heavy percentage of folks that are dealing with some really stressful things, being able to say, I can't take another one of these, and being more assertive about your own care. So I would say that's how I try to navigate the stressful waters in the work.
And in terms of, you shared this approach where, I believe just children, but it sounds like it could also apply to adults. We're kind of given almost a sandbox with some characters to play out whatever they wanted. And often you just let them go for it or something like that. Can you tell us about that and what the purpose is of that approach?
Yeah, sure. That's called sand tray or sand play therapy, and that's something that originated with Carl Jung in the Jungians. They really developed this modality, and I believe at first it was used arguably more for children in play therapy. But the premise of it is you have a sandbox about the size of maybe a small table. And essentially it's painted blue at the bottom, and you've got sand in it, and then there are usually in the office you'll have some shelves that have figures of all types, ranging from, humanoid to fantastical to animals to trees and nature. And essentially what you tell the client is to, just go over and pick some of these items off of these shelves and then make a scene in the sand. Or if they just want to play with the sand, they can. And the theory behind it is that it is a blank the sand is essentially a blank canvas for clients to project their emotions, their thoughts, even if it's largely unconscious, into the sand by the scene that they use, that they create. And so it is a creative and playful sort of intervention, and it can be used with adults as well. So that's something that I've had some experience doing, and I'm actually pursuing additional training. I don't know if I'm actually going to try to get certified to do it. One can get certified as a sand play therapist, but I certainly am currently trying to pursue as much training and literature as I can so I can do this modality more effectively. But, when I learned about it when I was in my master's in counseling program, and when I first learned about it, I wasn't using it. So at the time, I thought it was really cool personally, but like any sort of therapy modality, you have to be somewhat skeptical of the actual outcomes of the intervention. And I started using it with kids, and it had an amazing effect on the kids working out their traumas or their emotions, and it really blew me away. I mean, it was really easy for me to do. They'd come in, they would go right over to the sandbox with all the figures. They would make a scene, and then I might ask them to kind of tell me about the scene. And it was so interesting because they wouldn't in a cognitive way, or even a conscious way, they wouldn't link the story of the scene to what I knew their trauma was. And yet I could look at their scene while they were unpacking it for me, and I could see these connections, and then I could see the scenes changing every week. And the kids knew the scene was changing. And there was a lot of evidence to suggest that while the scene changed, their emotions were changing. Their trauma was there was an improvement to the trauma that maybe was really affecting them when they first came in. So I can say I've had firsthand experience in seeing the success of using it.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, thank you for sharing that. It's quite amazing. You kind of let them play in the sandbox with the different, the sand and the different toys, and you ask them at some point, what's happening in this scene, and they explain it to you. Oh, wow. And sorry, I'm having a little rain, interesting difficulties here. So they explain it to you, and then you kind of follow up with that modality week after week. And it sounds like you believe, like, just through setting those scenes and exploring them and then sharing them, there seems to be some...
Yes. That is what I'm saying. I mean, I definitely have seen the healing process occur, and with kids, like I've worked with elementary school age kids. Really, I could throw an interpretation at them, but I mean, their minds are way more imaginative. They're visual. They're not, some depending on the age. Kind of saying, Johnny, I think the dragon eating hero means, right? Like, I mean, that's all well and good, but really the way that I find out that success is happening is by checking in with the kid's parents. And that's how I knew that things were changing, because, I would just facilitate this, and then I would hear from the parents, like, Johnny's doing a lot better. This phobia isn't as intense as it was when you first started working with them, and then as it progressed, it was like suddenly Johnny is not phobic. about certain things. There isn't having a huge emotional reaction to certain things that used to be really scary or frightening. I've done it a little bit with adults, and with adults you can kind of have more of a dialogue about what's going on, you know, and you can kind of you can ask them for their interpretation of it, or you can even ask them to reflect on what might this mean, how might this scene connect to what you're going through right now, and you can kind of have a little bit more of a cognitive conversation about it with kids. And I'm not trying to put down kids; I'm just being developmentally honest here. Kids sometimes it either takes them a while or they don't want to talk about the scene outside of the language of the scene, right? So even if they identify with like the knight in shining armor that's in the scene, instead of reminding them the knight is them, you might just point out like, oh, you know, I remember last week's scene, the knight was doing this, now the knight's doing this, right? So you're speaking the language of the fantasy or of the imaginative play. You're not trying to pull this over intellectual thing by ignoring the imagination or crushing it and replacing it with adult cognitive functioning, which I think is, you know, I mean, I'm not a parent, but I have friends who are parents, and, you know, it's kind of like that's the moment where the kid can look at the parent and go, you know, Dad, you're being lame right now, or you're being boring, right? Yeah. So they can let you know when you're not speaking their language, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. I feel like that's quite an insightful approach, and highlighting the differences between adults and children. It's quite interesting. Hopefully, maybe some of us can find ways to use that with our own children or ourselves, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean, you know, to be honest, the person who another person who originated this even before Jung was the science fiction writer H.G. Wells, who wrote War of the Worlds and The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Time Machine, and he wrote this nonfiction book that was all about him playing in the sand with his kids. So he noticed that his kids loved to be in the sand, and they would use these toys and these figures to create these scenes and kind of create their own little world. And he noticed that, you know, let's say his son was having a bad day. Well, his son would go and play in the sandbox, and then after doing that for a while, H.G. Wells noticed that his son was feeling a lot better. Like if he went into the sand play upset about something, it created this healing process before his very eyes. And so, you know, I definitely think it's something that not just clinicians can use. I mean, I agree with you. I think parents or guardians of small kids, or even for themselves. I mean, I've met people I know who identify as Zen Buddhists who say that, you know, the sort of sand garden that is popular in the Zen tradition has some parallels to this sort of sand play modality. So it's definitely something that can be used by adults for your own practice, and can also be used with kids, regardless if you're a clinician or a teacher or a guardian or dare I say a minister. If you're working with you know, I think it's something that can actually be applied across the board, I would say.
It's almost something that, you know, once we understand that it could be helpful, just imagining that kind of setting in our mind, or realizing that's what we're doing often in maybe our fantasies, could give a little bit more direction to that, or maybe direction's the wrong thing to add to it, but thank you, Colin. That's wonderful.
You're welcome. Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we have a few more minutes left, and I would love to kind of turn this towards a project that I know you've started on, and it connects with a recent interview we had with Reverend Julie Conneron and Rosalind Taylor, that you've been looking at the Swedenborg's book Conjugal Love as well, and I'm just curious, where are you with that project, or what is it, or what have you?
Right. Well, I appreciate you asking about that. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I actually just submitted a paper to Professor Devin Zuber, on the subject. I took a special reading course with him that was entitled Swedenborg, Blake, and Sex. And during that semester-long SRC, he and I read a lot of, we actually read all of Conjugal Love. We read some William Blake, and we read some other literary folks, and also social scientists, et cetera, talking about sexuality and gender, and some were directly influenced by Swedenborg. Others, it was just useful to read their thoughts about sexuality and gender, and then perhaps look at Swedenborg and Conjugal Love through the lens of these more contemporary thinkers. And so, yeah, my experience with Conjugal Love was I was fascinated that Swedenborg was a theologian that wrote a whole book about marriage and sex and
in the 18th century, yeah. It was quite a progressive book for its time, which is kind of amazing to think about.
As a gay Swedenborgian with very much a lot of influence from William Blake and the Transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau.
They were each influenced by Swedenborg, right? I'm sorry to interrupt, but.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, they were each influenced by him in their own way, and I think they sort of had kind of this this moment where they appreciated Swedenborg. Swedenborg definitely had an influence on them, but they sort of progressed the theology or the philosophy forward into their own time. So they weren't just doing what some might do, which is reading Conjugal Love and then thinking, okay, how can we apply this stuff literally? They really felt like there was more critical nuance going on in their assessment of Swedenborg, and these are things I talk about in this paper that I just wrote. So if Devin Zuber is actually hearing this, part of the interview, he might want to stop now because I know he hasn't read my paper yet. Spoiler alert! There's spoiler alerts ahead. So, but yeah, no, I mean, I went from really thinking that a queering of Swedenborg meant sort of like a reinterpretation of Conjugal Love as it applies to the queer community, and I found that to be actually a difficult thing to do because, as you just said, we're talking about a text that was written in the 18th century and in a very particular culture in a particular time, and there are statements that he makes in Conjugal Love which I think do kind of transcend time and space, as it were, but I do think, after now reading the text twice now, all the way through, and my copy of Conjugal Love, as you can imagine, is extensively highlighted, and I've written tons of stuff in the margins and have really interrogated the text and interacted with it. And I would say that, I definitely take the position Emerson took when reading Conjugal Love, which is, there's some really great gems in that book, but there are a lot of things that maybe are not easily translatable into the 21st century. Because there are a lot of statements that Swedenborg makes that are very gender essentialist. Certainly, I think the original audience who would have appreciated this book were probably heterosexual cis males.
In Europe.
Right, and Europe, exactly. And if you don't fit that description, you're going to find your sexual expression viewed as actually being not conjugal, but infernal, and actually something that is not leading you towards a good relationship. So, I think, what I discovered by reading Conjugal Love is that Swedenborg's ideal of what a conjugal marriage is a pretty exclusive club. And so I think, I think that there's wisdom in him discussing the fact that relationships, that sexuality in particular is a way in which you can connect with not only a lover or a partner, but that in that union, there's this deep spiritual connection. I think if that, and that it's something that can actually go beyond time and space, right? And I think that those points made by Swedenborg, in my opinion, boil down to these core gems. I think are the greatest takeaway from the text. So, I think for me, my relationship with conjugal love, like my relationship with a lot of Swedenborg's writings, is knowing what the context was in which it was written, and being able to recognize that there is some cultural baggage there that needs to be recognized, needs to be mentioned up front, and then kind of ask the question, now that we've explored all that, how might one actually apply these things to people living in the 21st century, specifically the queer community? So that's sort of that's where I'm at right now with conjugal love in terms of my research and study of it.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that's really insightful and interesting to hear. And hopefully you can share that paper with us or with the public once it's done and edited, or maybe take the project further, because I feel like the more voices shared on that subject, especially voices that have been marginalized in the past, the better, of course. So thank you for sharing that, Colin.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to come back at some point or to communicate with you again once the paper has gone through the very careful and I would say scrutiny in a positive way of Professor Devin Zuber, to once I get his feedback and I kind of see have a dialogue with him, I'm definitely curious to see if this is going to be sort of like the first installment in a series of essays that I do that really is trying to ask this question: what might a queering of Swedenborg actually look like, both on paper and also in application? So I think this is just the beginning.
Wonderful.
Stay tuned.
Wonderful. And just to add my 2 cents, I apologize. But it's funny when I think about that book, and how Swedenborg is writing about metaphor, like the spiritual realm that's full of metaphor, and is less about like two physical bodies getting together when he talks about marriage, and more about kind of this conjoinment with these, with communities, even with these people who end up representing a whole. And to him, when he sees like two people as a couple, he sees this yin-yang relationship in the spirit, which may or may not relate to the bodies that they had or have in the physical world. And to him, that's masculine and feminine, and he can't help but take it back to that. But as he says all the time, no one can escape their context and their specific perspective, and I doubt that doesn't apply to him, except for God, right? And he made it very clear that he wasn't, just quoting Jesus or divinity or Sophia as he wrote these books, that he was looking at these things from his scientific-ish, perspective, having, gone through his scientific career, and wrote what he interpreted, how he interpreted it. And so I always like to remember that when reading Swedenborg, his context, as you were uplifting as well.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. I would agree. I would agree with the spirit of your thoughts just now. So that's great.
Well, it looks like we're about to end, but thank you, Colin, for coming on.
Thank you, Corey, for having me. It's been a real honor. Thank you.
Well, it's amazing. We'll have to have you back soon.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Well, wonderful. And if we are still on, because I know sometimes the voice is different than the actual player, hope you all go forth knowing you're loved and cared for.